Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. And I think one of the silver linings of having this convention online is that everyone around the world can join us with ease, and it's much easier to gather with much more convenience. So to begin with, we have a group of esteemed speakers who will be sharing with us different platforms or different ways that we can heal in group settings. And the first one of those speakers that will be joining us is Saman Hussain. Saman has several years of experience delivering experiential workshops, mediating national policymaking, and facilitating group dialogue. She utilizes an Islamically-oriented approach in her clinical work and is currently in a clinical internship providing counseling to disadvantaged communities. Saman is also an associated certified coach with International Coach Federation with a bachelor's in religious studies and foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. She's currently pursuing her MS in clinical mental health counseling at Johns Hopkins University. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Saman.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for that introduction. And as I was hearing that, I realized that I sent that in months ago, and I'm no longer at Hopkins, and I've already graduated. I'm no longer that internship, so that's ended. So it just reminded me of how things change. I'm really excited to be here with you all to talk about a subject that is very, very close to my heart. For those of you who might know me, I just believe in the power of groups. And I believe in the power of the Islamically oriented approach. And so if you can combine those two things together, you have a really a force to reckon with, I think, in our clinical work and non-clinical work. So I think we can move on to the next slide. Yeah. So I would like to talk and walk us through what it means to have an Islamically oriented approach to working with groups. And when I mean working with groups, this could be in group therapy, it could be in a workshop format, in residential retreat settings. But essentially, it's when the therapeutic work becomes more than just between the therapist and the individual. And the underpinnings that I will speak to the most upfront are, number one, the Islamically oriented approach, which we've had speakers speak to this week, and Dr. Rothman, Dr. Keshavarzi, and a lot of the literature that they've already pinned on this topic. And I'm going to be drawing on that as the foundation for some of this work. And weaving into that references to systems theory, and the idea that we are greater than the sum is greater than its parts, and that in systems theory, there's this concept of like the homeostasis, the need of the system to maintain a steady state, as well as systems also demonstrate this need for growth and elaboration. And so the group as a system, the group as an entity, we're mirroring that concept with the Islamically oriented approach. And also some work in the Gestalt approach that has a lot of overlap and some offering for what an Islamically oriented approach to group work can conceptualize, primarily because of the Gestalt concept of holism and the idea that it's not simply enough to know what's happening for each individual person as much as the larger Gestalt or the larger system that we occupy together. So those are really the three theoretical foundations. The other thing I'd like to say is, we can go back, is that we already know, and I'm not going to cite the research, but that group work is generally known to be pretty efficacious. A lot of research already exists to support that. And so we just want to weave in some of these principles. Ultimately, I would say Islamically oriented group work attends to the immediate presenting concerns of the individual members, while also cultivating a group container that facilitates a connection to a spiritual dimension pretty intentionally, because Islamically oriented work is both practical and transpersonal. It's both tending to the material and immaterial. Okay, now to the next slide. Right. So again, referring to the Islamically-oriented approach, this is the Islamic model of the soul that was developed by Rothman and Coyle in 2018. And I'm not going to go into depth on this because we've already had presentations on it, but I'm just going to draw out 4 of the assumptions that have particular relevance for group work. Number one, as an organizing principle in group work, number one is that capacity for connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is often just coined as self-actualization, or it's limited to self-actualization and humanistic approaches to group work. But we're adding in this third element, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and weaving in that reality intentionally, and holding that every individual group member, as well as the group as an entity, has that capacity to witness that connection. Number one. Number two, that there is a desire, innate desire to connect back to our original state of purity before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is again the fitrah. And number three, that the locus of the healing lies in the heart, and that in some ways what we're doing is we're awakening the heart of the group, which is sustained by an infinite source, Allah. And finally, that the life cycle of the human, even though they might be in the room with us and sitting in a circle in a group setting, their lifespan is far beyond the presenting concerns that they carry into the room, and being able to hold both what's immediate as well as what is eternal for the individuals in the group together. So I'm going to talk mostly today about principles that we can derive from these theoretical assumptions. We're not going to be able to get into too many detailed interventions, but I'll allude to some because that would require a lot more time. So next slide. Sorry. And so in keeping with this, I think that in Islamically oriented group work, 4 parallel processes are happening. And in fact, I really debated adding another circle here, which it should be down where the individual is written, which is that of the therapist, right? The 4 parallel processes, maybe even 5, is the individual level, which includes the individual group member and or even the therapist, because there's in the group, if for those of you that have done group work or have either been on the receiving end or delivered it, when you get into this almost like a zone of a space in groups, you sometimes forget who's driving this, it becomes almost hard to tell, is this the group speaking? Is it the individual? Is it the therapist speaking? Is there a bigger wisdom that's emerging that I need to give voice to? It all starts becoming this much bigger entity. And it's sort of this intangible sense, but for those of you that have lived in group spaces, you might know what I'm talking about. It's a felt experience of the group. And so what we're saying here is that the therapist is probably part of these processes, and that we're facilitating at all 4 levels of this process, meaning we're bringing the group into awareness of its connection. Obviously, individual group members into connection with themselves, the group. We're also acknowledging the existence of multiple subsystems, cultures, environmental influences, and we're acknowledging these at the same time committing to this 3rd dimension, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and calling this reality into the healing process. You can go to the next slide. So here, I also just want to give some language to what does it mean when I've been sort of alluding to this idea of this group as an entity. I added the word created entity because in a lot of Western literature, there is language that supports that groups are systems. They are created, the system is an entity. And so what I would add is that it's not just an entity, it's a created entity. So for example, in Imam Ghazali's book on patience and thankfulness in the Ihya Ulumuddin, there is a very extensive chapter in, there's a chapter in the book of the portion, on thankfulness, in which he details the interconnectedness of all things and how each creation is an entity in and of itself and interconnected to all other things and ultimately subject to the will of Allah. And he notes also that some of these things are known or visible, others are invisible or unknown, also alluding to the Islamic concept of the ghaib or the unseen. And so I would say the group is not a tangible a thing that we can touch, but it's an intangible creation, and it is ultimately also subject to the will of Allah. And we have to bring not only the individual into awareness of themselves, but also the group as an entity into awareness of itself as it relates to itself and as it is subject to the will of Allah. And just another reference is, this is might sound familiar to you if you're familiar with the Jungian concept of the collective unconscious. Again, this is also related to the Gestalt and Gestalt therapy, the idea that the group reveals itself to the group. And this, and largely systems theory, organizational systems theory, etc., also speaks to this phenomenon. We are just more intentionally rooting it in not just a thing that exists in and of itself, but it actually does have it can have an upward trajectory towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if we so intervene in that way, which again is keeping with the Islamic model of the soul, that with intentionality can point upwards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that is ultimately the primordial, innate human yearning, right? That is what we were created for. All right, next slide. So groups float between different stages of the nafs, and this is going to sound familiar to some that might be familiar, like the Tuckman model of group development, very popular in group theory, around the idea that groups form, storm, norm, and only then perform. But we would add this element of groups evolving upwards, and ultimately to that they can reach a higher stage of the nafs, and that it's not a linear process, but that these moments of witnessing higher levels of awareness can propel the group forward. Another thing to look for is the group living primarily in the nafs, the aql or the qalb, right? So groups do have this ability to influence one another, which is, in line with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says that, for example, I'll quote, a good friend and a bad friend are like a perfume seller and a blacksmith. The perfume seller might give you some perfume as a gift, or you might buy some from him, but you might at least smell its fragrance, so you get affected by the scent. And as for the blacksmith, he might char your clothes, and at the very least you will breathe in the fumes of the furnace. So we get influenced by those around us. And so with that idea that we're getting influenced by the group, ourselves, the therapist, and ultimately channeling that connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can swim in different stages of the nafs. And we can't get into different ways of, if we had more time, I would love to take a deeper dive into group dynamics that can signal which stage of the nafs that you're in, because I think there are ways of being able to name that. So finally, if we go into the next slides, I want to spend some time talking about the principles that are derived for group-oriented work based on everything I've just said. First one is witnessing. And I think this is fundamental. So witnessing in Shahada is embedded in the Islamic tradition. It is part of our very nature and is one of our most primordial memories, and that witnessing cannot happen alone. It is fundamentally done in relationship, which can be traced back to the soul's primordial witnessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's oneness in barzakh. The ayah in the Quran, which many are familiar with, Alastu bi rabbikum bala shahidna, where Allah asks, am I not your Lord? So again, witnessing is happening in relationship between the individual and Allah. The response is equally important, because we say bala shahidna in the plural, whereas we're in the collective souls are witnessing Allah. So I think that by extension, the group can be a vehicle for witnessing at multiple levels. And as a therapist, it's important to frame that each participant is here to witness, and which can give a profoundly transcendent role to both the participant as well as the therapist in group work. And oftentimes that sense of belonging is what groups are craving. And when you leave a group, you're often left without that feeling. But I think if we frame it in this powerful way of witnessing the soul, it has a deeper meaning, and it can have a deeper resonance. There are different interventions that go with this. You know, I can imagine, and I'll just allude to one, would be, you know, you can, with a group setting, do a timeline of the soul type exercise, which is would be a guided and embodied sort of walking timeline where you're mapping around the stages of witnessing, all the way from the barzakh, in which you step into that as a group together. And when you do that, and this could be an intervention in of itself, you're inviting participants to step out of all the other identities, right? All the other subsystems and subcultures, and really inviting them to taste and witness that pure state together. And you can do a lot more orienting work around that. But so witnessing is one principle. The second one is the next slide. Is the idea of oneness. And having been in many groups over the years and facilitated tons, I would say that there's a fragmentation in our time, so that even when we're in groups, there's an individualistic lens that carries itself into group therapy. So there is not a higher oneness to identify with, which often can lead to a sense of nostalgia. And I loved the connections I had in this group, but otherwise I'm still feeling abandoned. That can happen in participants of group who are in group therapy. So what we do, what I would propose the Islamically oriented approach does, is that it integrates a fundamental assumption of that oneness, the interconnectedness, which I'm also calling it the Tawhidic unifying principle, the interconnectedness of all beings. We're very affirmative about that, that we are mirrors to one another to help create a bigger whole. And the idea of the ummah, of the Muslim ummah, is also a huge concept of community. We are never in some way strangers to one another. We might be strangers together in this world, but we are not strangers to one another. And being able to bring this idea of therapeutic fellowship rooted, which is rooted very much in the Quran, into the space with intentionality, I think can build a sense of belonging that is not just rooted in me and you, meaning I would call horizontal, but also a vertical sense of this is some part of something bigger, right? And there are ayahs in the Quran, I'm not going to go too far into it, but you know, you might be familiar with the ayah of, "O mankind, indeed, we have created you from a male and female and made you peoples and tribes so that you may know one another." The ayah about saving one person as if we have saved all of humanity. So imagine if you're in a group and you're elevating one person, you're in some ways also elevating the collective awareness of the group. So by framing this, which is a very important therapeutic intervention, is Islamically oriented group framing, which is similar to Islamically oriented cognitive restructuring and CBT. Framing is a very unique group skill set, because you're not just framing the individual's experience, but you're framing what you're, yes? Did somebody speak?
I'm sorry, disregard that. I'm gonna mute.
It's okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. So yeah, so as I was saying, that when we frame it this way, we are inviting in a deeper level of experience in a group. We're facilitating healing at a deeper level, and making the role of the participant much more compelling and purposeful. I am here and I belong to humanity writ large due to this spiritual fellowship, right? So next slide. This is a concept, paradox, and treating it with opposites that might be, it's very familiar to many, is my guess. For those of you that have read the work of Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, Imam Ghazali is very much working with paradox in a lot of his work. And so this idea in Islam uniquely, I think, brings this, and it's very much resonant, I think, in our postmodern world, is the idea of both yes and, both and, not either or. There is light and there is dark. Opposites exist. You have pain and you have sorrow. And you know, there are other approaches like DBT, dialectical behavioral work, which brings in that idea of opposites. What we're doing is we're connecting it to a much larger theoretical foundation, a philosophical and spiritual foundation. Because a lot of the times in the absence of that, why should I accept that they're opposites? I'm attached to one side of this. Why should I? Whereas if we frame it through this larger narrative of the Islamic approach that has a philosophical heritage and a theoretical heritage that has a larger paradigm that supports the existence of opposites. This is a normal part of life. It makes it easier in some ways to accept than just a concept in and of itself. Similarly, we have the idea of the Jamal and Jalal attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which group members are almost always embodying some attributes. There is the idea of the qalb and the aql, and so the emotional and the intellectual. And so this is not unique per se to group work, but what is unique, I would say, is that groups present an unique opportunity to work on opposites, since there is an interaction with others who can invite in attributes or qualities that we're seeking to manifest within ourselves, or can help us, role play out those other various parts, which then frees up the therapist to hold the space for the entire process. And ultimately, you acknowledge opposites to balance out the group, to draw forth its wholeness, to elevate it in the different stages of the nafs. Okay, next slide. So this concept, I'm coining it as transcendence, because groups, as powerful as they are, they can very often cycle. And if you've been in groups, you might know what I'm talking about. There's a very strong pull, right? There's the human negativity bias that research supports, that we have this tendency to be attuned to negative validation, or negative feedback, negative experiences. It becomes like Velcro for us, not Teflon. That's the metaphor you might have heard. And so we want to be conscious of that in group settings. I also remember Dr. Malik Badri once spoke that when you're in a group setting, you have to be mindful of what's shared, right? Because Islam also has this concept of covering over the faults of another. So in the background, and acknowledging that in the background, I would say that the Islamically oriented approach is saying that we're actualizing to something bigger than the self, and that we are not just processing horizontally, meaning with one another, but as the skill of the therapist can also help us surrender upwards. Like, we share our story, we get validated, and we release it together. There is a notion of, you might have heard this concept of seduction of catharsis, right? I think Jacob Marino has acknowledged this in some of his work in psychodrama. And I think that while catharsis has its space, it's the first stage. There's a higher stage of actualization in which to evolve to. So it's a yes, and it's not bad in and of itself. We just have to be mindful of that. It could be, for example, you're in a group and a group member says, I really hated how my mom was, and you're going on about the treatment. And what happens in a group is another person's going to mirror that. Oh my God, that's how I felt. Thank you. Like, I now feel validated by you. We both feel validated in our shared experience of negativity. But then what? Right? That's the framing question. There is an orientation in Western work around just processing. And so we have to be mindful of that cycling in catharsis. The other thing we want to be mindful of is cycling in that negative sort of validation that I just gave an example of. Because you can end up cycling in the nafs al-lawama, or sometimes and even hint at or to lean into nafs al-amara. And so Islam allows for this. We just say that we bring in the potential for transforming that space. And so, I thought of this example, that when the Prophet ﷺ lost Khadija radiallahu anha and his uncle, and it was called the year of sadness, right? So we didn't call it the day of sadness. We didn't call it the month. The Islamic tradition calls it the year of sadness. So Islam gives space for that emotion. At the same time, we have to remember, right after that, he went on the Mi'raj. He elevated. right? He had this, I would call it processing horizontally, but he processed vertically. And obviously the Prophet ﷺ was always processing vertically. But the Mi'raj is an example of an elevation that happened very shortly after that experience of compounded loss. So there are multiple interventions that can happen in this space as well. And I'm mindful of time, and so I'm not going to be able to get into them in the now. So we can get to the next slide. Great. So this, I think that one of the most fundamental ways of facilitating hope that the Islamic approach, Islamically oriented approach, gives to the individuals and groups is its commitment and belief in the individual and group's access to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that connection. We're committed to that. And if the therapist can be as fully committed to that, it is an inherently hopeful theoretical orientation, because we are probably familiar with it, that our clients enter our spaces in sort of I call it a rahma deficit. And it's very pronounced in groups, right? Because it's not just 1-to-1, it is it's 20-to-1 or 15-to-1. And so there are a lot of, I believe that some of the other principles, such as the witnessing and the idea of treating with opposites and transcendence, can help facilitate that connection with hope. But this one, in some ways, I would say, is profoundly accessible when the therapist is clearing up their own spiritual and emotional blocks continuously. In the book of Fear of Hope by Imam Ghazali, he writes at length about the importance of hope. And he obviously also talks about striking a balance. But this is not necessarily unique to in group work. I would say it also applies to individual work, but in groups, facilitating to hope, facilitating to creating that as a foundation, then allows group members to do some of the inner works, do some of the work on the tahdib al-akhlaq, because without that, there might not be that ego strength available. And then the final slide, last one, is, again, this could be in a session in of itself, is just highlighting the importance of the role of the therapist in group work. Other speakers this weekend have already spoken to the importance of knowledge and with the Islamic tradition and the Islamically oriented approach. I would also add knowledge of group dynamics and systems work. And I would call action or intervention. This is derived again from a model from Imam Ghazali, where he says that these three things have to be happening in order for us to do the work on ourselves. Is you then derive appropriate interventions based on that knowledge. But in some ways, I think the state could be the one that holds both of those other ones, the inner state of the therapist and their own access to that connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that facilitating themselves as a channel for witnessing and holding that container for hope is what can really propel the experience of the group forward. All right, I think next slide. I think that's about it. So I'm very passionate about this topic. I could talk about it for years. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Saman. Your work is very inspirational, and it's great to hear about all these different factors that come into play with group work. And of course, we can speak to that after, during the Q&A portion. Our next esteemed speaker is Sema Yılmaz. Dr. Sema is an assistant professor and faculty of theology in the Department of Psychology of Religion at Sivas Cumhuriyet University in Turkey. Currently, she's a visiting scholar at Boston University School of Theology in the Department of Psychology of Religion. And she studies her postdoctoral research about anxiety and religion and existential psychotherapy. Her areas of focus are death psychology, existential psychology, and spiritual care. She gives lectures at master's and doctoral level, and at the master's and doctoral level, and she's a member
of the International Association of Psychology of Religion. And today she'll be speaking to us about Umrah worship and its relationship with death anxiety. And I will hand it over to Dr. Sema.
Assalamu alaikum, dear participant. Welcome to my presentation. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sema Yılmaz. I am currently a research scholar at Boston University School of Theology, Department of Psychology of Religion in the USA. I am also an assistant professor of Faculty of Theology, Psychology of Religion, Sivas Cumhuriyet University in Turkey. I study my postdoctoral research about anxiety and religion in existential psychotherapy. My research issues such as death psychology, existential psychology, spiritual care. The subject I want to present to you today is the relationship of Umrah worship with mental health in the context of death anxiety. There are two reasons why I investigate this research. The first one is personal and the other is scientific. My personal reason is a moment that I experienced during my first Umrah with my mother. She had been trying to deal with depressive emotions for a long time and often spoke of death. Sometimes she won't dead. She lost her older brother because of cancer when she was 19 and I was a child. I remember that she was experiencing the effect of this in my childhood. Umrah had a great influence on her. During the Umrah, when she first saw Masjid al-Nabawi, the following words she made me do this research. I want to live long for the first time. When I asked why, she said, I want to come here again and visit this blessed place again. She had a purpose to live longer. As for the scientific reason for the research is to investigate the effects of worship on mental health. Religion has an important place in the life of individuals, and every religion orders some worship with the principles of faith. Religion allows the individual to live a meaningful life in harmony with himself and his environment through beliefs and worship. The healthy relationship that an individual establishes with God through worship also makes a positive contribution to finding meaning in life and to death anxiety. During my visit to Umrah, which I held for the second and alone, I did a comprehensive research about Umrah worship and meaning in life, hopelessness, God perception, and death anxiety. I published the first part of the data I collected with the survey method during the Umrah as an article. The title of the first part is An Empirical Research on the Relationship Between Umrah Worship and Meaning in Life and Hopelessness. It was published in Turkish and English. I'm excited to present you the second part today. Subjective events happening in areas of belief, thought, and emotion of the individual, religious experience in the depths of heart, in other words, manifest themselves as actions, which are called worship in general terms. All acts that symbolize the faith and devotion to Allah can be named as worship. Worship is the manifestation of the law between the individual and Allah as a system of certain words, gestures, actions, and the visible side of the relationship. It is defined as specific rituals that have model shape and certain performance time and place. Salah, fasting, pilgrimage, Umrah, Zakat, prayer in Islam. Baptism, Holy Supper in Christianity, worshipping in front of the Wailing Wall in Judaism are the form of worship included within the context of this meaning. Umrah is visiting the Kaaba without being dependent on a certain time frame except for the pilgrimage month. There are certain rites to perform Umrah, such as entering a state of Ihram, ritual purity in which certain actions are not permissible, completing circumambulation, and Psy, striving to do a certain act, walking between the hills of Al-Safa and Al-Marwa. Umrah worship is a comprehensive and versatile worship, which contains psychological, sociological, physical, and financial characteristics. It has religious rules and physical conditions that are harder and require patience compared to other worship. Every worship and action performed during pilgrimage has a symbolic expression in Umrah, and these expressions affect the individual. Upon this effect, it is possible for the individual to have religious experiences during pilgrimage and to undergo an inward religious shift after pilgrimage. In this sense, redemption through repentance, tawbah, remembering that and consolidating certain moral values can be considered as prominent religious experiences in pilgrimage. Sharing several common elements with pilgrimage, Umrah has many advantages in terms of worship psychology, although seeming shallower compared to pilgrimage. Owing to that, Umrah is more economical than pilgrimage, that is not subject to a limited code, and that is possible to conduct any period of year. And those facts combined with the increase in the level of economic wealth, the interest towards Umrah has increased. Upon observing the statistic of the Department of Religious Affairs and Tourism Agencies, it is possible to say that more than 5,000 people with Mecca and Medina for the Umrah worship in the year, and that this number increases each year. Thus, Umrah is a more accessible worship in which more people participate when compared to pilgrimage, which is ruled to be realized by the individual at least one in his or her lifetime and can only be done at certain times of the year. In addition, it enables the individual to obtain same experiences and achievements with pilgrimage, except waqfa, devil stoning, and sacrificial rites. It's known that many individuals perform Umrah even though they don't perform daily worship, and that they choose worship of Umrah so that they can isolate themselves from worldly concerns and be alone with the higher beings in times of difficulty. Religion is a crucial answer to search for meaning and hopelessness of the individual by shaping his or her life, explaining his or her action, and surrounding his or her life as a void. As the individual turns towards religion, is search for meaning. Religion helps answering questions like, who am I? For what and whom do I live? Does my life has a purpose and meaning? For instance, Quran says, he who created death and life to test you, as to which of you is better indeed. He is the Almighty, the Forgiving. And say, my prayer and my worship and my life and my death are devoted to Allah, the Lord of the worlds. To state that both life and death have meaning for the faithful, including nearly all forms of worship, the Umrah worship gives the chance to individual to move away from life for a period of time, to clear his or her mind and observe him or herself by being intensely busy with the worship, so that they can deal with loss of meaning and hopelessness. That anxiety is associated with religiosity, and religious activities and attitudes are among the most important variables related to belief in life after death. Research indicates that religiosity may reduce that anxiety, but there are conflicting research findings. Some studies reveal that religious individuals experience less death anxiety. Templer found that those who were committed to their religious beliefs and who were confident that a life after death existed had low bad anxiety. In contrast, other studies have reported that religiosity increases that anxiety. Wink and Scott found that there is no linear relationship between that anxiety and religiosity. Studies conducted on samples of Muslims in Turkey have also found conflicting results. It's now reported that experiencing either a secure or an anxious attachment to God caused an increase in that concerns. However, the relationship between anxious attachment to God and fear of death is reported to be stronger than the relationship between secure attachment to God and fear of death. And I examined the relationship between the concept of God and that concern in a study conducted on a sample of children with an average age of 11 and found that a fear-oriented versus a love-oriented conception of God didn't result in a difference in death anxiety scores. This descriptive empirical study was conducted in a relational survey model and aimed at examining the levels of God perception and that anxiety and the relationships between them. The survey was conducted in Turkish voluntary participants visiting Umrah in Saudi Arabia, and the data collected by the survey technique were analyzed. Personal information form, God perception scale, and that anxiety scale were used as data collection tools.
Jazakallah, guys, inshallah, we're gonna pause the video here for now for the sake of time. Doctor is live right now for the Q&A. So if we pause it now, we can fit the last video in and then have a Q&A session where she can answer some questions live, inshallah. And we will upload this presentation. So inshallah, you guys can finish watching that.
Okay. Yeah, and also it would be interesting to see the findings of Dr. Sema's study. So if you have any questions regarding her findings, please feel free to ask them in the chat box. Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Priester. He's the chair of the School of Interdisciplinary Health Professions and a professor in rehabilitation counseling at Northern Illinois University. He has a Ph.D. in counseling psychology from Loyola University in Chicago, and a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling from the University of Iowa. His research areas focus on the interface of Islam and psychology, the measurement of Islamic religiosity, the prevention and treatment of addictive disorders, and the integration of spirituality into the counseling process, and the training of culturally responsive clinicians. Very important work. Please, I hand it over to you, Dr. Paul.
Rehabilitation counseling. Hello, my name is Paul Priester. I am a professor in rehabilitation counseling and the chair of the School of Interdisciplinary Health Professions in the College of Health and Human Sciences at Northern Illinois University. I'm very happy to be a part of this conference. I really want to thank the people that put it together. It's a very impressive group of presentations, and it's really exciting to be a part of this. I want to say I'm especially excited about not having to spend half of my time doing basic definitions. It's nice to be around an experienced, wise group of people, and I really appreciate that. I do. All right, this paper will explore whether this idea of whether the 12-step model for treating addictive disorders is sort of a culturally relevant model for Muslims, okay? Can it be used with Muslims in a Muslim cultural context? So addictive disorders represent a major public health concern. You know, it's interesting that they cut across national, cultural, and religious boundaries. Alcoholics Anonymous has developed a successful approach to the treatment of alcoholism and other addictive disorders. So this next sentence, I spent over 31 years trying to take all my knowledge and experience of the 12-step model and write a succinct sentence capturing it. So let's see how it goes. The 12-step approach entails participants following a spiritually based behavior modification regime that involves personal surrender to a higher power, self-examination, restitution, and altruistic assistance to others with a similar problem. Well, the 12-step model was developed in a European American Christian context, that is in Akron, Ohio in 1935. It was by the original designers, by Bill Wilson. It was designed to be used with other groups. He fully intended on it being used with African Americans and Native Americans to help other cultural groups treat alcoholism. It has been successfully used in other cultural contexts. For example, the World Services Office of Alcoholics Anonymous keeps statistics, and approximately 1/3 of the members of the global AA Umrah live in Central or South America. So that's a non-European American, but still a Christian context, but it has been shown to be relevant with other cultural groups. One could make the argument that a model cannot divorce itself from the worldview of the creators. So the originators of this model, it inherently reflects the Christian values, beliefs, and practices of the originators. And there's the question of us whether, if it was developed in a Christian context, is it appropriate or inappropriate and possibly culturally antagonistic to Muslims in a Muslim cultural context. There's even the possibility that the 12-step approach could represent an ethnocentric form of European American Christian imperialism. So this paper will explore two things. First, I will briefly discuss some of the cultural barriers that could exist that would stand in the way of Muslims making use of the 12-step model. Then I will present a research study, a mixed methods research study I did in Turkey and the Islamic Republic of Iran, looking how Muslims negotiate these cultural barriers. So let's explore some of these cultural barriers. I want to really thank, a few years ago, we had a group on a Yahoo group, a Muslim mental health group that was very active at the time, a really intellectually stimulating conversation with theologians and psychologists and psychiatrists exploring Muslim mental health issues. And we got on a discussion of whether group therapy is appropriate or not. And then that transitioned into whether 12-step models are appropriate for Muslims. And about half of these barriers I got from them, from that lively discussion, and the other half I thought upon reflecting on this for a long time. So let's explore some of the potential cultural barriers. First, there's this idea of mixed gender composition of the support group meetings. So it could be considered culturally unacceptable to discuss intimate material, personal content in the presence of members of the opposite sex. Also, obviously holding hands, physical contact, holding hands in a ritual closing of the meeting, which is often done. People hold hands and say a prayer. It could obviously be a problem if men and women who are not married are holding hands saying a prayer. Another potential barrier is this idea of a proscription against the public disclosure of sin. Here, the idea in a Muslim worldview is that talking about sins in public is prohibited, lest you encourage another to sin by glorifying the act. So I don't want to encourage other people by talking about what I have done. Now, here's what I really appreciate about Islamic thinking, and in some ways it's so much deeper than other modes of thinking, that it just does not only look at the act, but delves deeper and looks at the motivation. So there's an asterisk with this prescription against public disclosure of sin. If there is a Sharia countenanced reason for doing it, it would then be allowed. So for example, if I am trying to overcome my addiction by talking about my addiction, that's a good motivation. That's a good reason. Okay. Another thing to think about with this is if I'm at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting and it's fellow addicts, I'm not really encouraging them to become addicts. They already are addicts. So if we see that really there's ways around this potential obstacle that we can see. Here's one that I think is the most problematic, okay? It's been the tradition in 12-step meetings in the United States to hold hands, like I said, and close with a prayer, okay? And for a long time, they would close with the Our Father. Now, this is also known as the Lord's Prayer. This is problematic for a number of reasons. If you really look at the content of that prayer, there's elements of shirk in that prayer that are problematic. Okay, so it's important to note, though, that this is a controversial topic within 12-step communities in the United States, and that the 12-step model is in Alcoholics Anonymous. They explicitly say we do not associate with any. We're not affiliated with any religion, okay? The idea is it's a spiritual program. It helps people come closer to God, but is not affiliated with any religious program. And there's been a move away from the Star Father because it makes it appear that the 12-step programs are endorsing Christianity when they do not. My estimate would be probably half of the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in the United States now have stopped using the Our Father because feeling that it too closely affiliated them with a specific religion. And instead, when they don't say the Our Father, they say the Serenity Prayer. And if you look at the Serenity Prayer, even though it came out of a Christian context, there's no elements of shirk within the Serenity Prayer that would be problematic. Next, we delve a little bit into the 12 steps. The fifth step is we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being. This is potentially problematic, the other human being part of this, the exact nature of our wrongs. This I think that we'll see that this can falsely be understood as another form of shirk if you think that I'm seeking absolution from a human being, okay, instead of from Allah. Well, that is not the point of the fifth step. If you understand the fifth step, it is not an act of confession or reconciliation, as Roman Catholics would call it. Rather, it is a process of gaining self-knowledge and accepting responsibility for my actions. Now, if we look at, the Islam as a religion wholly embraces and really encourages and glorifies self-examination and self-understanding, we find this in the Quran, we find this in many hadiths. I know that hadiths, you always have to be careful that certain hadiths may have more validity than others. And I don't have time to go into all the different ways that Islam encourages self-exploration and self-understanding. The Khalil Center, that's one of the sponsors of this, has a wonderful short article on their website about self-understanding and how it's a Muslim's duty to pursue self-understanding. So if we really look at the fifth step that way, it's really not a problem, okay? How about the issue of is it appropriate to host a 12-step meeting at a mosque? Okay, it's problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, the encouraging non-sinners to sin. So if I'm Paul, a cocaine addict, and I'm around fellow cocaine addicts in the meeting, that's not a problem. But what if the meeting's at the mosque and you see me going into the meeting that could potentially encourage the person to engage in the sin? That could be a problem. The other thing is that, people could come to the meeting in the beginning or relapse and come to the meetings under the influence of intoxicants, and that would not be acceptable to come to the mosque while under the active influence, acutely intoxicated. So that's interesting. That's a good argument there. I really don't have the time to go into it here, but it's just fascinating to look at the history about how the Prophet Muhammad brought about the change in attitudes of people towards intoxicants. And in one part of that long history, he was using the mosques to give lectures about the effect on health of intoxicants. So the Prophet himself used mosques to try to change attitudes of the use of intoxicants. But there are some problems there if we think about meetings being held at mosques. So here now we get to my research question, okay? Which is, how do Muslims in Muslim countries negotiate these cultural barriers? So it was a mixed methods approach. Over a 3-week period, I used naturalistic observation, and I attended AA and NA meetings in Istanbul, Turkey, and in Islamic Republic of Iran, and Isfahan and Tehran. During these meetings, I used naturalistic observation, and then I also interviewed 20 individuals asking how they negotiated these cultural barriers, and 10 people from Turkey, 6 from Isfahan, and 4 from Tehran. One thing that stands out right away is that these 2 different Islamic cultures seem to have a mixed utility of the 12-step model. So let's compare the 2 largest cities in each country. We got Tehran has about approximately 9 million, Istanbul about 15 million, okay? When we look at, I want to emphasize non-English speaking meetings, because in almost any large city, there's an expat community of Europeans and Americans that have English-speaking 12-step meetings, and I'm not interested in that, okay? I'm interested in Muslims in the Muslim context. So non-English-speaking AA meetings in Istanbul, population 15 million, give or take a few. Number of weekly AA meetings, 10. Number of weekly NA meetings, 7. In Tehran, population 9 million, give or take a few. Number of weekly AA meetings, 20. Number of weekly NA meetings, 300. So already we notice right here that there's something going on here, that Iran has embraced this model and is successfully using it. And Turkey, it doesn't seem to be doing so well. I went to one meeting on Wednesday night in Isfahan. There were 300 to 400 Muslim men. It was a joyous celebration of recovery. People dancing, singing, bringing flowers like they do in Iran. And they were celebrating people's periods of sobriety. And I asked them, are there usually this many people at this meeting? And a fellow told me, oh, no. Usually it's much larger, but there's an important soccer game on and everybody's at home. A lot of people are at home watching that game. So it's interesting to notice that difference, right? We see a differential outcome, that one culture seems embracing it and one is not doing so well. We'll explore that a little bit why a little bit later on. And another potential cultural barrier is this mixed gender composition. So what about discussing intimate material in front of members of the opposite sex? Now we really see divergent things going on. In Turkey, no problem. Men and women talking about personal intimate material in front of each other, no issue. In Iran, it's usually gender-specific meetings for men, meetings for women. If it was mixed, they would refrain from discussing intimate material. So one individual went to Overeaters Anonymous meetings in Tehran, and that individual said that we still really see a Western model of behavior in Overeaters. Maybe it's a self-selection. The idea of Overeaters Anonymous is a rather Western concept, I think. So they're in Tehran, they openly discussed intimate material in front of other people. How about with the mixed genders, about the physical contact with someone you're not married to, holding hands? Turkey, no problem. People, men and women, they're not married, hugging each other, greeting each other during the meeting, holding hands during the meeting, hugging each other after the meeting. Looked just like a typical Western 12-step meeting. In Iran, usually a gender-specific meeting. If it wasn't a gender-specific meeting, they would have a circle of men over here and a circle of women over here. And in one meeting, they had a giant circle with women on one side and men on the other. I said, well, how are you doing that? And it turns out there was a husband and wife joining the two halves of the circle. So there was no problem negotiating the idea of physical contact between next member of the opposite sex that you're not married to. They figured that out in an eloquent way, no problem. How about prescription against the public disclosure of sin? In Turkey, not a problem. They openly discuss things. In Iran, this was not seen as a problem unless members of the opposite gender were present, and then they refrained from details once again. How about the reciting of Christian prayers? Remember, this was really the thing that could be a problem. This could be a real issue. And what we found at every single meeting I went to, they closed with the prayer. They did not use the Our Father. They used the Serenity Prayer. And the Serenity Prayer, like I said, has no concept of shirk in it, and there's really, they did not see it as an issue whatsoever. Now we go to some of the qualitative interviews, talking about what's the nature of the fifth step, how important is it, and what's the function of it. Every single person, 20 people interviewed, they all unanimously said it's a very, very important, the aspect of sharing with another human being. It has nothing to do with confession or forgiveness. That is all about seeking self-understanding, gaining self-knowledge through sharing it with another person with the same problem. So that was very interesting, I think. How about the appropriateness of hosting the meetings at a mosque? In Turkey, none of the meetings were at a mosque. In Iran, none of the AA meetings were at a mosque, but this was because they were going to do this at first, and they asked permission, and the government said, yes, you can do this, but give us a list of everyone there, and we'll tell you if you can have the meeting or not. And the people in AA said, no, that goes against the tradition of anonymity. We can't tell you who's at the meeting, so we're not going to allow you to have the meetings there. It also caused some suspicion about why are they meeting there. And the joke is, this is not true, but the joke is, if you're looking for the AA meeting in, especially in Tehran, you just look for the strange fellow taking pictures of people entering a door, like the idea that the government's suspicious of what goes on there. So none of the AA meetings were held in a mosque. About 10% were held of the NA meetings were held in a mosque in Iran. So what's the conclusion? Remember, we always have to be careful about what's really 12-step doctrine or literature and what's the culture, okay? So nowhere in the literature does it say you're supposed to hold hands and say the, Our Father. Even within AA, within Western AA, even from right at the beginning, from like 1940 on, there were two traditions, an Akron tradition and a Cleveland tradition, where in the Cleveland tradition, they would say, "Hi, Paul," and they would hug each other and they would have a lot of physical contact. In the Akron tradition, they wouldn't say, "Hi, Paul," and they wouldn't hold hands while saying the prayer. So, and both of those were valid expressions of the 12-step model, okay? We have to be careful not thinking that some of these things are intricate parts of the model when they're not, okay? When we look at the difference between the prevalence in Turkey and Iran, I think that now some of this is changing, but speaking in broad generalizations, I think a lot of people would agree with me that Turkey is a secularized Western, maybe one of the most Westernized of the Muslim countries, and that there's changes going on. It's changing now, and it's becoming more religious, but I would say in general, speaking at a gross level, that Turkey in general is a lower level of religiosity. Iran is a much higher level of religiosity. So maybe the issue, I was asking the wrong question. Maybe I should have asked the question of not does it work in Muslim countries, but does it work in countries with high or low levels of Islamic religiosity, okay? Some limitations to this study, okay, first of all, okay, I love Turkey, I love Istanbul. I've spent more time in Istanbul than any other city outside of the United States. I love Turkey, I love Istanbul, all right? I love the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Iranian people are my favorite people in the whole world. I love them, okay? You'll never find a gentler, kinder culture, all right? But from stepping back here, you could argue that I picked two least representative of the Muslim global called Ummah, okay? That Turkey is Western and secularized, Iran is Shia, which is, only about 15 to 20%. So a really good criticism would be that I picked non-representative Muslim countries to look at this, okay? I will notice that when I was doing this in Saudi Arabia, that there were no non-English speaking meetings in Saudi Arabia when I was looking at this. Future research, there is an Islamic version of the 12-step model called Miladi Islami. It's beyond the scope of this, but there are some problems with it, I think, from my perspective as someone who studied the 12-step model and addictive recovery from addictive disorders. I won't go into that, but there's some problems. They remove at the fifth step, the critical component of admitting to another human being they've removed, that is just admitted to yourself and to Allah. But it would be interesting to see if that has better outcomes with Muslims than traditional 12-step model. We really need to look at degree of religiosity, either at the individual level or at the cultural level. This is really problematic, okay? Esma Shana Masri and I published a scale, Religiosity of Islam scale, and we found problems trying to compare cultures, cross-culturally compare relative degrees of religiosity. It's difficult to do, but I do think you have to take into consideration that we can't just globally look at Muslims or Muslim countries without looking at degree of religiosity. I think it's a strong moderator variable that we need to pay attention to. I want to sincerely thank Dr. Raman Radfar, he's in charge of addictions treatment and prevention in Esfahan and all of South Iran. He's a wonderful, brilliant guy. And also in the middle of this, his wife, who was pregnant, had hit one of his children right when we were in the middle of this process. And he was very gracious, and I'm very grateful for him for his support and his time. While I have your attention, I'm also going to use a self-serving question that right now I'm doing a study, and I'm desperately trying to find clinicians that provide counseling or psychotherapy services to Muslims. I'm interested in Muslims who are suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder. Ideally, I'm looking for Muslim refugees living in a non-Muslim country who are suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder especially with religious teachers. If you know anyone who's a clinician dealing with such a population, I would really, really appreciate it if you could give me that information so I could do a brief interview with them. I'm trying to really understand that dynamic of how to treat that population. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I'm really feel honored to be part of this. And once again, I want to thank the organizations that put this wonderful conference on. And I will talk to you later, all, hopefully.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Paul and Saman and Sema, for your wonderful presentations. Just to kind of open up for Q&A, I did have some thoughts, and from my experience in working with clients one-on-one individually, I've noticed there may be a correlation between the clients. Of course, through the therapeutic alliance, the client may feel like you as a therapist believes in that their ability to change and that they have that capacity. And that's on an individual level. However, in group therapy, and especially at Kaiser when we teach classes in relation to depression or anxiety, we're often told to really encourage patients to sign up for group therapy, not individual therapy, right? And sometimes people don't understand that, and they say, but I would rather have individual therapy because there's a lot of shame surrounding group therapy settings. And so it does take a lot to help the client, break down those internal barriers that really obstruct their ability to change and grow. And I think, something that I've noticed, and maybe, of course, from your expertise, you can speak to in a more in-depth way, is that I've noticed clients who have a connection to self and more self-compassion, they are able to overcome those barriers in a much quicker manner in order to help themselves, because they want to change and they don't want to stay in a state of stagnation that often, addictions and struggles and, that are all very common struggles that individuals share collectively. But I don't know if you've noticed in your own work, either with AA groups or, with group therapy settings, if you've noticed the same thing, that correlation between self-compassion and their likelihood to sign up for group therapy or go to AA or NA. And I'll open up to both of you before we open the Q&A.
What I would say is that no, actually, I would notice the opposite, that when people first come in, that they're filled with shame and self-hatred. And then through the process of attending the groups, that then they get to that point of self-acceptance and self-love. Usually the biggest barrier, this is where Muslims have a great advantage for this 12-step model. The biggest barrier is usually people not believing in a higher power, okay? And so you're coming in as a Muslim and you already believe in Allah, you're already halfway there,
Mm.
And it's a matter of, of surrendering and asking for help and the mutual support of other people to do that. And eventually they get to that self-love and that self-acceptance,
Mm-hmm.
but usually they're rather consumed with shame and self-hatred when they first come in. And the group setting helps destigmatize that they see, here's someone else who I respect, who I can see they love themselves and accept themselves, then maybe someday I'll get there. And then sort of an installation of hope, like Alan would say.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Paul. So that's that Rahma deficit, I think, that Saman was referring to, which a lot of clients come into the therapeutic setting with. But I'd love to hear from you, Saman, as well, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think there's truth to what you're saying. I think it's both and. So it's not, as we all know, oftentimes you want to have a client both in individual therapy and in group therapy. So I don't necessarily think it's either or. I actually think that it's that first step. Like if they can just walk through the door and enter the group space, that's all we need. Because once you're there, I have zero doubt you're going to want to stay there, because you kind of what Dr. Priester said, you are witnessing. I love that word. You are just being asked to witness beyond the self. If anything, I actually think you get out of yourself more easily in an instant in group therapy, especially if it's oriented in the Islamic paradigm, because by definition, you're being asked to transcend. And actually that's relieving oftentimes for individuals in therapy who sort of get tired of being wrapped up in their own presenting concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. And we do have a question from the attendees for Saman. And this attendee is asking, taking what we can understand from the Islamically-oriented group approach, how could this knowledge and practice be applied in educational settings, particularly Islamic schools, and what role could educators and teachers play as group facilitators?
Yeah, I'm very, very passionate about this. If you haven't noticed, I think everyone can benefit from a group-oriented approach that's rooted in the Islamic paradigm whenever you're working with anything beyond the one-on-one setting. I believe educators can be trained in an Islamically-oriented approach to group work because they are, I mean, it's not, we might not never call it therapy, but they are, education almost always has a component of, when we talked about knowledge, state, and action, there's knowledge transference happening. There is the state of the educator, right? And there is tarbiyah, there's an element of working, they're helping teach them how to be human beings in school settings. So I think, I would say a lot of the same train the trainer components that a psychologist or a coach or a therapist might want to embark on to get trained up to do this approach, I think a lot of resonance would be applicable on the educational front as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, you know, it's incredible that we're able to even have these conversations. I think, just a couple of years back, it was still very, shame, it's covered in shame, and not something that a lot of people would even consider, signing up for. So it's incredible that we can also incorporate these models in schools and different settings. And it's not just, from a therapeutic perspective.
Great. And can I add one thing?
Yeah.
By the way, it's weird because my own video is lagging. Is my sound okay?
Yeah. Yeah. You're great.
It's so weird to look at myself. Okay. I'm not going to look at myself.
No, you're great. You're great.
So the other thing that I'm finding is repeatedly, because I also work a lot in secular audiences and with atheists, with people who are yearning for something spiritual, but not yet committed to anything, that partially because of the research on positive psychology and logotherapy, meaning-oriented work,
Sorry, Akila.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. I don't mean to just, I'm so sorry. We have Dr. Sema here. I just really quickly, Dr. Sema, if you could just go over your results.
Yes.
Many people are very interested in that. We just have a few minutes. Actually, we're going to run over. So let's just take 5 minutes for you to go over your results really quickly, if you wouldn't mind. Can you hear us, Dr. Sema?
I think you're muted, Dr. Sema, because we can't hear you.
Still can't hear you. Okay, let me pull up your video and maybe I'll put the last.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
We can hear you. Can you hear us? Okay, Dr. Sema, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. I'm going to go ahead and pull up your video and play the last few minutes.
Worship, it was between God. Oriented God perception level of the research in the score average of groups as a result of the variance analysis study. So to summarize the findings, the level of God perception of the research group is above average and the level of data anxiety is below average. Also, low-oriented God perception level of the research group is significantly higher than average, fear-oriented God perception level is found to be below average. That anxiety level of the research group was found to be below the average. There is no significant correlation between God perception and that anxiety of the individuals who perform the Umrah worship. According to gender variable for the comparison between the levels of God perception of individuals who perform the Umrah worship, there found no significant difference between the males and females score of God perception and its subscales. The level of that anxiety of females is higher than that of males. God perception scores significantly increase as the age development periods diverge. That anxiety score significantly decreases as the age development periods diverge. The God perception scores of married participants is higher than that of single participants. That anxiety scores of the research group according to civil status, there was found no significant difference between the score averages of groups. According to these results, God perception score significantly decreases as the educational status increases. The that anxiety scores of the research group according to educational status, there was found no significant difference between the score averages of groups. Last of all, we can say that Islam as a lifestyle also guides the individual's feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. In Islam, there are prayers covering many areas of life such as prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and zakah. These worships are performed individually or collectively. Worship has an effect on all psychological mechanisms of a person. Umrah worship is a comprehensive and versatile worship, psychological and sociological, physical and financial features together. The Umrah worship is a concentrated worship which bringing together many different worships. It is carried out by thousands of people every year. It has both psychological reflections and spiritual gains, also positive effect in terms of mental health of individuals. The findings we obtained can be said that Umrah worship has a positive effect on the positive God perception, one of the important indicators of mental health, and lowers the level of that anxiety that negatively affects mental health.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. If the speakers wouldn't mind dropping their emails in the chat box for the questions we didn't get to, inshallah, they can be answered directly. And now the closing remarks will begin shortly. So thank you, Jazakallah khair, for everyone for attending. Really appreciate it. Yep.
I think we still have another 10 minutes.
Oh,
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
Yes, no worries.
Oh,
So
wow.
maybe we can get to a few of the questions, Afina. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm so sorry to cut you.
Okay, no worries. No, you're fine. So I think those, thank you so much, Dr. Sema, for sharing your findings with us. I think Umrah, for those who have an opportunity to go on Umrah, can have an accelerated healing and transformational effect for those experiencing it. There's a question for Dr. Priester. Someone is asking, one of the attendees is asking, my question, do you come across similar programs to the 12-step program that prepared based on the Islamic framework and principles? And I think you referenced that, Millati Islami.
Yes, Millati Islami, you know, like as someone mentioned in the chat room, that is only in the Philadelphia area, and it is really, really struggling to survive. Really, my recommendation would be, like as I presented in my paper, that these identified cultural barriers really are, they're not insurmountable barriers. I would really recommend that Muslims seek out the 12-step meetings in their community, and that there is the thing about 12-step is it's ubiquitous. It's almost in every community. It's free, and it's there. There's recovering addicts and alcoholics. While they would not be Muslims, the whole point of the 12 steps is that the person is to find their own higher power. But there are people who have recovered who would embrace them and help them overcome their addiction. And in no way would that present a threat to the Islamic faith, I think. And that's the best path, because it's, like I said, it's everywhere, it's free, and it's just waiting for them. That's what I would recommend.
Okay, I just tried to provide a synopsis of what you just mentioned in the chat. There's a question for Saman from one of the attendees asking if you could elaborate a little bit on the example of, or the analogy of the perfume seller and the blacksmith. I don't know if Saman is still there.
Oh, I'm still here. I was
Okay.
trying to figure out how to, I'm struggling with screen. I only see you, so I think that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I mean, everybody's there and listening, so you're fine.
Okay. So I can read it again here, just so folks recall. It's a hadith from Bukhari Muslim, where the Prophet ﷺ said, "A good friend and a bad friend are like a perfume seller and a blacksmith. The perfume seller might give you some perfume as a gift, or you might buy some from him, or at least you might smell its fragrance. As for the blacksmith, he might char your clothes, or at the very least, you will breathe in the fumes of the furnace." And how this relates to group work is that Islam, and through this hadith, very much acknowledges that we are not operating in a vacuum, that each of us has an influence and impact on one another. Even if it's literally, what I love about this is the blacksmith, you might not even have to be engaged in the same trade. You're walking by and spending time with the blacksmith, you are becoming influenced by the smell, you're getting charred, your clothes are changing. And so that's where both the gift and the opportunity of working with groups lies, the immense potential of being near the perfume seller. We're essentially wanting to be the perfume sellers. But if not facilitated with an awareness of that connection and that channel to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and without clearing up our own blocks as therapists, we run the risk of also inviting in that, the char and the furnace, where we can allow groups to sort of, as I called it, the negative cycling. So I hope that elaborates on that.
Yeah, and I think to me that sounds a lot like presence. The power of presence and of companionship, and every companion has a different presence and a different aura that it brings to the relationship, and it can either benefit you or harm you. So I think it really relates to what you're talking about. Yeah, absolutely. Someone is asking, one of the attendees is asking, what kind of programs would you recommend for fresh graduates who want to specialize in Islamic psychotherapy? I think, if any one of you would like to respond to that, and based on your recommendations.
Don't want to dominate, but a lot of folks asked a lot of questions about this sort of work, and so I was giving piecemeal answers. And I would just say here, so I am affiliated with the the International Association for Islamic Psychology, and through that we are developing materials on this matter. And IIP already offers trainings on an Islamically-oriented approach to individual and frankly just working with human to human using an Islamic paradigm, and we're going to be evolving and inviting and work at the group level as well. So I would say be tuned to that, sign up for that if you're not signed up for that already. And I'm sure other platforms might exist as well, but the IAIP exists for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Saman, for all your feedback. And one of the attendees made a comment to Dr. Priester saying, I really believe our Islamic community needs to find a way to integrate 12-step group therapy as a model for treating addiction. There's so much stigma, but it is highly relevant and an adaptable model. Take what you like and leave the rest. Absolutely. And I think through Dr. Priester's talk or presentation, it was really evident that you can tweak it to fit if you have a faith orientation or certain beliefs, it absolutely is adaptable to, you know, whatever background you're coming from. Someone is asking, how does a blacksmith and musk seller relate to the online virtual mode of delivery? That's a really good question, I have to say.
That's a really funny.
Presence differs online, right? It's not the same. It's not the same.
It is and it isn't, right? Because
Yeah.
one of the folks, because we're designing a lot of group work right now, and one person I remember said that if you just imagine you're together, then you're together. And if you imagine that you're apart, then you're apart, even if you're in a room together. So of course, some hudur, some presence might not come across. I'm a very kinesthetic trainer, so I'm moving and I'm, you know, so I'm very limited. And at the same time, it's what you said, may I call you Heba or Dr.?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that presence, I believe it comes across beyond the screen. And in the tradition of Islam, historically, we know that some of our, the traditional Islamic teachers, they can have connections that go beyond the physical, right? There's a transmission, the Islamic tradition goes beyond the physical in terms of transmission. So I think it's both, and we can learn to live with both. And I do believe that there are very powerful ways of learning in the online way as well.
Yeah, and I think it's what you tell yourself too, right? It's what you convince yourself of, just to get through this period. And I'll end with this question for Dr. Priester. Is the use of the 12-step program reduced to substance addictions, or has it also been adopted for behavioral addictions in majority Muslim countries?
You know, well, I mentioned in my presentation that in Tehran, there's a small active Overeaters Anonymous community. I really haven't looked into it. I know it, you know, it has been applied to other, what we call process addictions, very successfully with compulsive gambling with Gamblers Anonymous. And there's 2 separate 12-step models for treating sex addiction. I don't know the prevalence of those in Muslim countries, okay? I really don't know. I know that they're very successful in European and American countries. I don't know, because I really can't answer that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. And it is an area that has much room for growth. I would just like to end with a statement by Imam al-Ghazali stating that gratitude, the state of gratitude, is more superior to the state of patience, because patience involves a lot of suffering and turmoil. And so I think group therapeutic settings such as AA or Saman's work that she spoke about, and even I would even say with Umrah worship for Dr. Sema, if you have the ability to experience the beautiful, you know, transformational experience of Umrah, I think it really instills hope, right? If you're in a state of like struggle or despondency, being in a group setting is more expansive, really channels more expansive emotions. And hope is definitely one of them, and it's on the way, on one of the higher rungs up the ladder to the destination of gratitude. And I think, you know, we're very grateful to have all 3 esteemed speakers join us this morning towards the end of the conference. And I hope everyone who attended today's session greatly benefited as much as I did, and I greatly enjoyed listening to each one of your presentations. And thank you so much to the attendees. And please, we have included the email addresses of Dr. Priester, Dr. Sema, and Saman. Please don't hesitate to reach out to them if you have any further questions that we didn't get to. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.